The appalling thing is not the tumult, but the design. Through all the fire and smoke, we perceive the evidence of calculating organization. The managers remain studiously concealed and masked, but there is no doubt about their presence from the first. These words were written in the mid-1800s by the British historian Lord Acton about the French Revolution, an eruption of organized barbarism that slaughtered millions. But those words apply to many of the events that have bloodied the pages of 20th century history as well, and the studiously concealed and masked figures behind those tragic events continue their pursuit of absolute power over the world's political and economic system. The influence of those concealed figures can be felt in many of the most important developments of our time, such as the outbreak of 2 world wars, the emergence of communism as a global threat, the creation of the League of Nations and then the United Nations, America's military travails in Korea and Vietnam, the creation of a strategic partnership between the United States and ex-communist nations, and the accelerating drive to create a new world order through the United Nations. In all of this, we can see the evidence of calculating organization, or what can properly be called a conspiracy. According to some politicians and commentators, people who believe that many significant developments are the product of premeditated conspiracy are themselves a menace to civilized society. For example, Ira Strauss, the U.S. coordinator of the Committee on Eastern Europe and Russia in NATO, has written the following: "Conspiracy theory is doing America real harm. Long incubating underground, it has grown into the greatest enslaver of minds since communism. It irrationalizes thinking on every issue. It kills. It turns millions of Americans against their own country. Once a mind is trapped in the circular logic of conspiracy theory, it rarely finds a way out on its own." Strauss describes people who subscribe to conspiracy theories as anti-government extremists who, quote, "are capable of blowing up federal buildings," unquote. In other words, that conspiracy theorists are plotting against the government. In fact, so-called anti-government extremists have been arrested in Georgia, Washington, and Arizona, and prosecuted on conspiracy and sedition charges. In each case, the crime appears to have been a belief in conspiracy theories and possession of firearms. Curiously, many critics of political conspiracy theories accept the fact that criminal conspiracies exist, and that some of them, such as the mafia, have continued for hundreds of years and spread their influence worldwide. But relatively few people understand that in nearly every society in history, the largest and most ruthless criminal enterprise has been government itself. 16 centuries ago, St. Augustine asked, "Justice being taken away, what are kingdoms but vast robberies?" Government is nothing more than legalized coercion. This is why politics is historically the most fertile ground for conspiracies. Unless government is itself ruled by law and compelled to serve the ends of justice, it becomes a conspiracy against the rights and property of the law-abiding. In 1956, Harvard University sociologist Pitram Sorokin published a survey of heads of state throughout history, which documented that 1 out of every 4 rulers in history is a murderer. He concluded, "The rulers of the states are the most criminal group in a respective population. With the limitation of their power, their criminality tends to decrease, but it still remains exceptionally high in all nations." Perhaps the best example of the criminal seizure of a government by a tiny cadre of conspirators is provided by Vladimir Lenin's tiny Bolshevik movement, which gained control of a nation spanning 11 time zones and created an international network of subversion, terror, and crime that dominated more than 1/3 of the globe. In his 1996 book, Dossier, The Secret History of Armand Hammer, investigative researcher Edward J. Epstein writes that Lenin spent most of his life at the epicenter of an international conspiracy that was predicated on the idea that an entire world order, capitalism, could be subverted and overthrown through the actions of a small cadre of professional conspirators. The conspiracy's success would proceed from secrecy, discipline, and deception. The real would be hidden, the false displayed. Opponents would be confused, diverted, and ultimately misled into collaborating in their own destruction. Epstein documents that Lenin's conspiracy also depended upon the collaboration of capitalist co-conspirators, such as Arm & Hammer. What has become of Lenin's conspiracy? Although the Communist Party of the Soviet Union no longer has a constitutional monopoly on power in Russia, the nomenklatura, that is, the party elite, retains its power. Russian investigative writer Yevgenia Albats points out that in 1990, the Soviet Communist Party created an invisible party economy in the form of cartels protected by the renamed KGB. The KGB, which is now referred to as the Federal Security Service, or FSB, also retains its power. A December 1996 Toronto Globe and Mail dispatch from Russia reported, over the past 2 years, the Russian secret police has regained most of the powers and functions of the KGB and resumed its old habits of arbitrary persecution and detention. In short, the criminal elite that seized power in Russia in 1917 retains control of that unfortunate country, and it still makes use of capitalist co-conspirators. We have seen how Arm & Hammer conspired with Lenin. One of Hammer's valued collaborators was a Tennessee senator named Al Gore Sr., who kept the FBI from pursuing an investigation of Hammer. When he retired from the Senate, Al Gore Sr. was rewarded with the lucrative position at Hammer's Occidental Petroleum Corporation. The Gore family fortune helped Al Gore Jr. also win election to the Senate, whence he ascended to the vice presidency. Now Vice President Al Gore Jr. and Russian Premier Viktor Chernomyrdin preside over a commission that helps today's Arm & Hammer-style capitalists engage in taxpayer-supported joint ventures in Russia. All of this helps answer a question often posed by critics of the conspiratorial view of history. That is, what motivates the conspirators? The wealth, power, and influence of Arm & Hammer and the Gore family illustrate that the material rewards of conspiracy can be substantial. Another criticism of the conspiratorial view is that conspiracies must be relatively small, and that a conspiracy to control the world would be too large to maintain the needed discipline. Once again, to answer this objection, it is useful to refer to the model of organized crime. Large-scale criminal conspiracies often display both a division of labor and diversity of motives. Scholarly studies of criminal societies document that organized crime networks are hierarchical in structure. For instance, a drug cartel employs drug producers, refiners, smugglers, wholesalers, and street-level pushers. It will also employ armed foot soldiers to defend the cartel's territories, agents to bribe law enforcement officers, infiltrators within police departments, and financial specialists who will launder drug proceeds. Decisions governing the cartel are handed down through a chain of command, which ultimately answers to a small criminal elite at the top of the pyramid. Furthermore, not everybody employed by the cartel participates for the same reasons. For instance, the peasant farmers in Colombia who grow the coca leaves that are refined into cocaine do not necessarily share the motivations of the leaders of the Cali and Medellin cartels. Yet the peasant farmers who earn a subsistence living by cultivating coca leaves can be considered part of the cartel's criminal conspiracy. The same is true of those who enlist as bodyguards or foot soldiers, or who provide financial services for the cartel. To extend the parallel a bit further, we may refer to the late Claire Sterling's book Thieves' World, which documents the creation of a Pax Mafiosa, a worldwide consolidation of organized crime groups from Russia, China, Japan, Italy, South America, and the Middle East, leading to what she refers to as a New World criminal order. If criminal elites in the world's underground can cooperate for their mutual enrichment, why can't criminal elites in the political realm do the same thing? Bearing all of this in mind, let's return to the political world and consider briefly the example of the communist elite that rules mainland China, which, like Lenin's party in Russia, came to power through conspiratorial means. The contemporary Chinese Communist Party consists of 53 million people, and it exercises control over the People's Liberation Army, the People's Armed Police, the Public Security Bureau, the controlled press, and the other means of regimenting the lives of 1.2 billion people. The Chinese Communist Party itself is governed by a party congress of a few hundred officials. That congress, in turn, is presided over by a 28-member Politburo. But the Politburo itself cannot act without the authorization of its 6-member standing committee, which is the apex decision-making body in Communist China. In short, a nation of 1.2 billion people, 1/5 of the entire human population, is essentially ruled by 6 men. If 6 men can rule more than a billion, why is it so difficult to believe that a relative handful of men employing conspiratorial methods and acting through political channels could effectively rule the world? Once again, if common criminals can create a single underworld government, why can't political criminals create a single world government? We should also remember St. Augustine's warning: either governments serve the ends of justice or they become vast criminal enterprises. The framers of the U.S. Constitution were aware of the essentially criminal nature of most rulers, and this understanding is the foundation of America's political system. In a speech to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Benjamin Franklin warned that all history informs us that there has been in every government and kingdom a constant kind of warfare between the governing and the governed. There is scarce a ruler in 100 who would not, if he could, get first all the people's money, then all their lands, and then make them and their children servants forever. Furthermore, as Madison wrote, government is the greatest of all reflections on human nature. Being firmly rooted in a biblical understanding of man's fallen nature and having a detailed knowledge of political history, the Founding Fathers created a system in which both the government and the citizens would be ruled by law. To paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, the founders sought to bind their new government down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Suspicion of government is not paranoia or extremism. It is what Madison described as the prudent jealousy regarding our liberty that is part of the duty of every American. The foresight of America's Founding Fathers can be seen in the tragedies that have enveloped our world in this century, the century of unlimited government. Political scientist R.J. Rummel has documented in his book Death by Government that during the first 9 decades of the 20th century, at least 170 million people, and perhaps as many as 360 million, have been killed by governments. It is though our species has been devastated by a modern black plague, writes Rummel, and indeed it has, but it has been a plague of power, not germs. Rummel points out that although the common and fundamental justification of government is that it exists to protect citizens against the anarchic jungle that would otherwise threaten their lives and property, a preeminent fact about government is that some of them murder millions in cold blood. This is where absolute power reigns. The desire for absolute power inspired Nazi and communist conspirators, and it is that same illicit desire that motivates those who seek to create a world government. For decades, the John Birch Society has warned of the existence of an international power elite that seeks to abolish the independence of all nations, including the United States, in order to create a world government that would be socialist in nature. That power elite consists of banking, political, and academic leaders, as well as revolutionary socialists, and it is united by a common desire to control the world's wealth and regiment the lives of mankind. One of the most compelling testimonies of the existence of that elite was provided more than 30 years ago by celebrated historian Carroll Quigley, who was President Bill Clinton's academic mentor at Georgetown University. In his voluminous work, Tragedy and Hope, The History of the World in Our Time, Quigley declared, "There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates, to some extent, in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records." Perhaps the most recognizable symbol of that elite is David Rockefeller. According to journalist Bill Moyers, Rockefeller is the unelected if indisputable chairman of the American establishment. Rockefeller sits at the hub of a vast network of financiers, industrialists, and politicians whose reach encircles the globe. What some critics see as a vast international conspiracy, he considers a circumstance of life, just another day's work. Carroll Quigley pointed out that the ruling elite, quote, has no aversion to cooperating with communists, end quote. This is certainly true of David Rockefeller. After returning from a visit to Communist China in 1973, Rockefeller expressed these sentiments in a column published by the New York Times. Whatever the price of the Chinese Revolution, it has obviously succeeded not only in producing more efficient and dedicated administration, but also in fostering high morale and community of purpose. The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. It should be remembered that the social experiment that so enchanted Mr. Rockefeller resulted in the extermination of at least 30 million human beings.